The autumn of 1884 came to the upper Powder River country, the way bad news comes quietly at first, and then with a certainty that made the quiet seem, in retrospect, like a warning that had not been heeded. The first frost arrived 2 weeks early. The second one followed before the ground had fully recovered from the first. Men who had lived in that country for years looked at the sky in October and discussed among themselves what the sky appeared to be saying, and what it appeared to be saying was that the winter ahead had intentions. Most people in the settlement of Granger Flats heard this and did what people do when winter makes its intentions clear. They cut more wood, they banked their root cellars, they checked their stovepipe joints and their door seals, and they went about the practical business of preparing for a winter they expected to be hard, without yet knowing how hard would prove to be. Vera Mossland did something different. She was 53 years old. She had been a widow for 18 months, since the spring fever had taken her husband Edmund in the particular swift and unreasonable way that fever takes a strong man when it is determined to, leaving her with a cabin, a dog, 11 acres, and the kind of financial position that is not desperate but requires careful management, which is sometimes harder than desperation, because it requires sustained attention rather than a single decisive act. She had 3 sheep. She had always kept a small flock for wool for her own spinning, for the practical insurance of an animal that maintained itself on rough grazing and produced something useful every year. 3 sheep was not a flock. It was not enough to run a serious wool operation, but it was enough to produce, at shearing, a quantity of raw fleece that most women in her position processed for their own spinning and used through the winter for knitting and weaving. In the autumn of 1884, Vera Mossland did not spin her wool. She took it to the cabin walls instead. This required explanation to the neighbors who saw it, and the explanation she offered was brief and practical. The wool was going into the gaps between the logs, packed tight against the chinking, layered into the spaces where the winter wind found its way through, and where the existing mud and grass chinking had cracked and settled over 7 years of freeze and thaw. She was rechinking the cabin. She was doing it with wool rather than mud because wool did not crack in the cold, did not shrink when it dried, and did not require a spring thaw before it could be applied. These were all accurate statements. They were also not the complete explanation. The complete explanation lived in a letter she had received from her sister in Norway the previous winter, a letter that described, across 3 careful pages, the construction methods used in the old country for farm buildings in the high valleys, where the cold was not a seasonal inconvenience but a fundamental condition of existence. Her sister's husband had grown up in such a valley. He had described, through the letter, what his grandmother had packed between the timbers of the family's stone barn in the years before manufactured insulation was available in that region. Wool, raw, unwashed, pressed tight into every gap, sealed at the surface with a thin coat of lime wash to discourage pests. Not because it was traditional, because it worked better than anything else available. Vera had read this once in January and had not acted on it immediately, because acting on information in January in that country is not always possible. She had read it again in March. She had read it a 3rd time in September when the early frost arrived, and the sky made its announcement, and she stood at the wall of her cabin and pressed her hand against the existing chinking and felt, with the clarity of a person whose attention has been sharpened by being alone, how much cold was coming through. She took her will to the walls. She had not yet discovered exactly what the winter would require of the decision. But she knew this the way a woman knows something she cannot yet prove, that cold is not an argument. It is a condition, and the correct response to a condition is preparation, not opinion. The neighbors on the road watched and said what they said. She continued working. She had 1 shearing's worth of raw fleece from 3 sheep. It was not enough to do the whole cabin. She understood this before she began, and she had planned accordingly, not by purchasing more wool, because wool at commercial prices was a cost she could not absorb in the same season she had recharged the wood supply and reinforced the root cellar door, but by prioritizing. She worked from the north wall first. The north wall was the wall the wind found. In 7 years in that cabin, she had learned its behavior with the specificity that comes from 7 winters of living close to it. The particular draft that appeared at the second log from the floor on the northwest corner, the cold seep that developed overnight at the lintel joint above the north window, the place where the existing chinking had been repaired twice, and had failed twice, and would fail again given the opportunity. She knew this wall the way a doctor knows a patient they have treated for a long time. She packed it section by section, working from the base upward. The technique was not complicated, but it required patience, pressing the raw fleece firmly enough into the gap to fill it without compression that would reduce the material's ability to trap air, which was the mechanism her sister's letter had described. Not the fiber itself that held the warmth, but the still air captured within the fiber. The wool was a matrix. The air inside it was the insulation. Pack it too tight and you lost the air. Leave it too loose, and the wind moved through the fiber and carried the warmth away. She found the right density by feel across the first morning, and did not deviate from it. By the end of the first week, she had completed the north wall and the eastern half of the west wall. She had used the majority of her fleece, and had enough remaining for the south wall's upper courses, and the window surrounds on the north and east faces. The south wall she left largely as it was. The south wall was the wall that received the winter sun, however weak, and the south wall's chinking had held better than the others. She applied a thin coat of the lime wash she made from the small store of quicklime she kept for the outhouse, working it into the surface of the packed wool with a brush, until it sealed the outer face without penetrating deep enough to compromise the fiber beneath. This part drew more comment from the road than the wool itself had. A woman named Frances Archer, whose husband ran the feed store and who was not an unkind person, but who expressed her opinions with the directness of someone who has never found directness to cause problems she was not prepared to manage, stopped at the fence on a Tuesday afternoon and asked Vera whether she was aware that she had put her spinning fleece into her cabin walls. Vera said that she was aware. Frances asked why. Vera explained. The same reasoning she had given before, the Norway letter, the principle of air pockets in fiber, the advantage over mud chinking in freezing conditions. She explained it the way she explained most things, without hurry, without defensiveness, in the specific words of a person who has thought something through to its conclusions and is describing the conclusions rather than defending them. Frances Archer listened with the quality of attention of a person who has asked a question she did not expect to take this long to answer. She said she supposed it might work. She did not say it would. Vera thanked her for stopping and went back to the lime wash. She was not ready to claim anything yet. What she lacked was winter. What she had was a north wall packed tight with Norwegian logic and 7 years of personal knowledge about where the cold entered and where it had to be stopped. The cold was coming. She had not yet finished being ready for it. November came down from the northern passes like a debt being collected. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in the first week and did not climb back. The creek at the bottom of the settlement's east pasture froze solid by the 14th and did not thaw again. The families of Granger Flats settled into the cold management of an early hard winter with the practical resignation of people who have done this before and know what it costs. Vera Mossland went through the first 2 weeks of November with the careful attention of a scientist conducting an experiment she has waited a long time to run. She kept a record, not a formal document, a page in the back of the household ledger, updated each morning with 2 numbers. The interior temperature when she woke, measured by the small thermometer mounted on the east wall, and the amount of wood she had consumed the previous day, measured in the units of her own stacking. The number of pieces taken from the pile beside the door and fed to the stove across the previous 24 hours. By the end of the first week, the record was telling her something. The interior temperature when she woke, before the morning fire was built up, was holding at levels that did not match the outside temperature in the way she had previously experienced over 7 winters. In those winters, a night at 15 degrees outside had typically produced a morning interior temperature in the high 20s, cold enough to see breath, cold enough to make rising from the blankets a deliberate act of will. In the first week of November 1884, with the outside temperature reaching 12 degrees on 2 consecutive nights, the morning interior temperature did not drop below 34. 34 degrees was not warm. But 34 degrees was not what 7 previous winters in this cabin had produced at 12 degrees outside. The number that 7 previous winters had produced was 26, sometimes 24. 8 degrees of difference, held through the night, from wool packed into log gaps. She read the number in her ledger on the morning of the 8th day, and allowed herself one moment of satisfaction before going to feed the dog and bank the stove for the day's work. She also noted, in the margin of the ledger, the wood consumption figure for the previous week compared against the same week in the previous winter. She had burned 31% less wood to maintain the same interior comfort. 31% less wood was not a small number in a settlement where wood had to be cut and split and stacked by a woman alone on 11 acres, with a crosscut saw and a splitting maul, and the energy available to her, after everything else that 11 acres and one woman required. She was not ready to call it proven. But she was no longer only hopping. The blizzard arrived on the 4th of December. It was not the worst storm that country had seen, and it was not the mildest. It was the kind of storm that is remembered not for a single dramatic quality, but for its persistence. 3 days of sustained wind and temperature that the settlement's residents would describe, in letters written afterward, in the particular vocabulary of people who have lived through something they do not wish to minimize, but are also unable to exaggerate because the facts are already sufficient. The temperature on the second night reached 11 below zero. Not below freezing, below zero. In the settlement of Granger Flats, that temperature in combination with the sustained wind produced conditions that tested every structure that had gaps where the wind could enter and exploit the difference between the inside air and the outside air. The test was not gentle and it was not evenly applied. It found the weakest places in each structure with the same impersonal efficiency that cold always finds weakness, and it worked there until the interior temperature of each building reflected the degree of preparation its occupants had made. The Hollings family, whose cabin was the newest in the settlement, and whose chinking had been applied with speed rather than care in the summer rush of construction, spent the second night of the blizzard burning furniture. The Pearson family, whose north wall had been patched the previous spring with a mixture that had appeared adequate in October, discovered on the morning of the second day that the patch had not held, and that the gap it left was communicating directly with a wind that had been waiting for it. 2 other families in the lower settlement moved in together on the first night and shared wood and body heat through the second, which was not a comfortable arrangement, but was a sufficient one. Vera Mossland's cabin held at 38 degrees through the second night of the blizzard. 38 degrees, with the fire banked at midnight and rebuilt at 5 in the morning. The dog slept on the rug beside the south wall, without apparent concern. She sat by the window on the second night and watched the dark where the settlement was, and kept her lantern burning, because a light in a window during a storm is a form of information, and she wanted the information to be available. She watched the Hollings place and the Pearson place and the 2 houses in the lower settlement, and she thought about the north wall and the lime wash and the letter from Norway and the 31% less wood she had burned in November. And she did not say anything about any of it because there was no one in the cabin to say it to. The dog looked up at her once. She told him they were fine. They were fine. When the storm broke on the third morning and the settlement began its accounting, Frances Archer was the first person to come to Vera's door. She did not come for social reasons, and she did not pretend to. She came because her own cabin had been cold enough on the second night to make her husband's cough worse than it had been, and because she had remembered a Tuesday afternoon in October when a woman at a fence had explained something to her that she had listened to with insufficient attention. She asked Vera to explain it again. Vera explained it again. She brought out the ledger page with the temperature records and the wood consumption comparisons. She showed Frances the north wall where the wool was visible at the surface beneath the lime wash, the texture of it, the way it had compressed into the gap without the shrinkage that mud chinking showed, the way it had not cracked. Frances looked at it for a long time. She asked where a person would get enough wool if they did not have sheep. Vera told her. The shearing waste at the Granger Ranch south of town was routinely discarded. The coarse belly wool from commercial flocks that the processors did not take. The tags and second cuts that no spinner wanted. All of it suitable for this purpose, all of it available for little more than the asking. Word was still moving before Frances Archer had reached the end of the lane. Vera could feel it the way a person feels weather before the clouds arrive. The winter of 1884 to 1885 did not relent in December. January was harder than December had been, which was not what the settlement had hoped for but was what the settlement received, and the families of Granger Flats managed it with the collective ingenuity of people who have been taught by circumstances to be creative with what they have. The Hollings family rechinking their north and west walls in January, not with mud, because the ground was frozen and mud was not available, with every piece of raw fiber material they could source. The Pearson family did the same. 3 other households came to Vera's door in January with questions. She answered each time with the same patient specificity she had brought to Frances Archer's visit in December. The method, the density, the lime wash, the source of waste wool at the Granger Ranch, the temperature records she had kept in the back of the ledger which she showed to everyone who asked because the numbers were more persuasive than anything she could have said. She noticed most things. She had noticed, in a letter from Norway in January of the previous year, a detail about wall insulation in High Valley farm buildings that most people would have filed as foreign novelty, and she had filed as applicable information. She had noticed, in the autumn sky of 1884, an early frost that the experienced men of the settlement discussed and she had acted on. She had noticed the specific gaps in her north wall, where 7 winters had taught her the cold entered first, and she had addressed those gaps before the cold arrived rather than after. She had not been lucky. Lucky implies randomness. What she had applied was not random. It was attention. The particular, sustained, daily attention of a woman living alone who had learned that in the absence of someone else to notice things, she had to notice everything herself, and that this was not a hardship but a discipline, and that a discipline practiced consistently produces, in time, a knowledge that looks from the outside like luck, but is from the inside something more durable. The families who were chinking their walls in January with waste wool from the Granger Ranch did not have Vera's October timing or her November temperature records, but they had the method, which she had given freely to anyone who came to the door, and the method worked regardless of when it was applied. Their January was warmer than their December had been. Their wood consumption came down. Not 31%. They had not had the full autumn to seal every gap, but enough to matter in a winter where every cord of wood was a calculation. In February, a woman 2 settlements over wrote to Frances Archer, asking about a method she had heard of for chinking with wool. Frances wrote back. The method was moving in the direction that useful things move when the conditions are right for them, not through advertisement, not through announcement, but through the specific recommendation of people who have tried something and found it true and told the next person they trust. Vera did not know how far it had traveled by spring. She knew what her ledger showed, a winter managed on wood consumption that represented, against her 6 previous winters in that cabin, the most efficient she had achieved. She knew what the thermometer had told her on the coldest mornings. She knew that the dog had slept through every blizzard night without moving from the rug, which was the kind of evidence that does not appear in ledgers but is not for that reason any less accurate. The spring came the way spring comes in that country, reluctantly, in stages, with 2 weeks of mud between the last snow and the first real warmth. She walked the exterior of the cabin when the ground was soft enough and examined the wool chinking at the surface, pressed into the gaps exactly as she had placed it, the lime wash intact, no frost heaving, no shrinkage, no cracking. She would not need to rechink in the autumn. She might need to add a course to the east wall where she had been conservative with her material in October. She would source the wool from the Granger waste pile in July when the shearing was done. She knew what to ask for now, and she knew what the rancher would say, because she had asked him in October, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man being asked whether he minds if someone takes away his rubbish. He had told her to take what she needed. She intended to. She was, for the first time in the 18 months since Edmund had died and left her with this cabin and this land and this life that was entirely hers to manage, exactly where she had meant to be. Not comfortable, comfort was not the word for it, and she would not have chosen it. Not finished, she was not the kind of woman who thought in terms of finished. But steady, warm, in a cabin that had held through the worst of what the winter had delivered, that held not through luck or through the extra wood that steadiness and luck are often confused with, but through the specific decision made on a warm October afternoon to press raw wool into the gaps of a north wall before the cold arrived to find them. Word was still moving. She could feel it the way a person feels weather before the clouds arrive.